Welcome. Thank you very much for joining us on your Saturday morning. My name is Rick O'Shea. I am the patron of Epilepsy Ireland and a broadcaster for RTE. Why are we here this morning? This session deals with the medical cannabis treatment of epilepsy and all of the questions that surround this issue. You can use the hashtag EINC2021 if you're talking about it on social media. And as Peter said, we'll be doing a Q&A session towards the end of this. So again, if you can use the Q&A box at the bottom rather than the comment box, it means stuff tends to get a little bit lost if it goes into comments. Please, if you have questions for later on at any point during the session, you can put them in and we'll deal with them in the Q&A box. Joining me this morning are three of Ireland's leading neurologists. Professor Colin Doherty is the Professor of Epileptology at the Academic Unit of Neurology in Trinity College Dublin, and he's a consultant neurologist at St James's Hospital. He has clinical and research interests in the areas of brain imaging, clinical epileptology, traumatic brain injury, and digital health. And he's also a principal investigator at Future Neuro, that's the SFI Research Centre for Chronic and Neurological Diseases. Professor Norman Delanty is consultant neurologist at Beaumont Hospital and the principal investigator at Future Neuro. As well, the SFI Research Centre for Rare and Chronic Neurological Diseases. He was the clinical investigator in the development of the now nationally used epilepsy electronic patient record. And he's also the founder of the Irish Epilepsy and Pregnancy Register. And for his sins, he also happens to be my neurologist as well for many years. Dr. Bryan Lynch, finally, is the consultant paediatric neurologist at Children's Health Ireland at Temple Street and at the Central Remedial Clinic in Clontarf. Dr. Lynch was a special interest, he has a special interest in epilepsy and was previously co-director of the epilepsy program at the Children's Hospital in Pittsburgh. Gentlemen, good morning, and thank you for joining us on your Saturday mornings. This is going to take us a little while, but maybe we'll begin by, for people who are perhaps joining this session and to know little to nothing about the subject, Colin, you very kindly volunteered to just give us a kind of a version of where this all begins and how we've managed to make it to the point we are now in terms of the use of medicinal cannabis and the treatment of epilepsy. It's not an easy brief, but do what you can.
Okay, thank you, Rick. Yeah, so what I want to do is talk about two things first before I talk about the current situation with CBD. Talk about terminology, because people using different words for different things or the same things. And then I need to talk a little bit about botany, unfortunately, to try and understand where we're going. So the first thing is, people will think of the term medicinal cannabis is widely used. There's a lot of people in the cannabis, in the psychiatric psychology world who prefer us to use terms like cannabis-based medicines, and I can get into that if you want. But those terms are interchangeable, really. Of course, we know about recreational cannabis, medical marijuana, medical weed. All these words are sort of the same thing. You're going to read about them. And remember, then there's a huge variety of street names for cannabis. I'll just go through a few of them: weed, dope, ganja, grass, dark, reefer, Mary Jane, pot, green, nug, skunk flower, hay, blaze, boom, rope. And the Spanish people talk about mota and daga, and North Africa, they talk about kif. So, you'll hear all of those words in relation to discussions about treatment. And it's important today, we're all more or less talking about some of the same things. In botanical terms, this is a very old plant. It genetically probably goes back about 6 million years, and it's related to the hop, which we make beer with. So genetically related to that, there are two kind of natural forms. One is called Cannabis sativa, which mainly comes from China, and the other one is Cannabis indica, which mainly comes from India. The Cannabis sativa has a higher amount of psychoactive forms of cannabis, such as THC, which make you high. The Cannabis indica has less. And there's a huge variety of in-betweens. The best way to think about cannabis is it's like either like the vine or like a grapevine or like tea. So it's hugely dependent on where you grow it, hugely dependent on the temperature, hugely dependent on sunlight. And then, of course, there's crossbreeding. So for thousands of years, people have been crossbreeding the plant to make higher levels of one or the other. So, for instance, 2,000 years ago, much more indica was produced, and it tended to be much more fibrous plant. And it was the basis of this thing we call hemp, which was essentially what we made ropes and sacks. It was actually the most important industrial compound in about 2,500 years ago. Everything that stored items was made from hemp. And then later on, of course, it became clear that when you put more of the psychoactive components, you bred more psychoactive components, more the sativa type, that people realized that there was a psychoactive component. And so there's reports going back thousands of years of people, smoking it, eating it, using it to get high. Now, actually, simultaneously, there's also reports about the same time going back about its medicinal use, about using it for various types of chronic conditions, including muscle spasms and seizures and convulsions. And so they go back many, many thousands of years. And there's often reports about people getting huge benefit from smoking or eating cannabis, but also then unfortunately succumbing to addiction on the other side. So these reports go back many thousands of years. On the chemistry side, what do we know about it? So essentially, there's about 450 cannabinoids in a cannabis plant, and these are what are called phytocannabinoids. Phyto meaning plant-based cannabinoids, and all of these cannabinoids can be ingested by the human or the animal, the mammal, and they interact with receptors in the body called the endocannabinoid receptors. So this is the endocannabinoid system, and these receptors are all over the body. Every single organ can accept cannabinoids, and they act. And in fact, we're still trying to work out what they do. They, broadly speaking, have many, many physiological functions. Some of them are good, some of them are protective, some of them are bad if you take too much. But essentially, we're still trying to find out what these phytocannabinoids do inside the natural system. The brain actually is full of these receptors as well. It's actually the hardest place to get to. Because of this thing called the blood-brain barrier, getting chemicals across into the brain is hard, but they do cross into the brain, and they do cause effects in the brain. Now, this is where we just need to try and simplify it. So of all these 540 chemicals, we only know the functions really of two of them. And one of them is called THC, tetrahydrocannabinol, and that is essentially the drug which causes people to get high. Has strong psychoactive effects. And so that's what you get in street cannabis, in recreational cannabis. It's the reason that many, many countries have legalized this drug because, people want to get high. And, in the same way as they take alcohol to change their perception, people take cannabis. And there's about 150 million users worldwide every day taking recreational cannabis. What's important to know about that is that street cannabis, the amount of THC in street cannabis has changed radically since the 1970s and 80s, from 2 or 3% of the plant up to about 15%. So there are quite potent THC versions out there at the moment on the street. The other chemical we know, and we're increasingly learning about, is CBD, and this is cannabidiol. It doesn't appear to be psychoactive. It gets into the brain, but it doesn't appear to have any effects on making people go high. So if you take a pure cannabidiol, you don't get high. But it does appear to have many, many interesting effects. And what emerged in the last 20 years is that this appears to be a very, very important anti-epileptic compound. And when I say appears, I mean there's still a lot of research going into it. Many people will know that there's a pure pharmaceutical grade CBD called Epidiolex. It's licensed across the world, including in Europe and the United States. It's not reimbursed in Ireland. We may get to talk a little bit about that. This is why a lot of people in Ireland are not on it. It's very expensive. But essentially that is a pure CBD, and it appears in clinical trials since about 2016 to have a very profoundly positive effect on some forms of epilepsy. And we'll get into talking about those, but broadly speaking, about 10% of people with very, very, very bad epilepsy will go seizure-free, which is an amazing effect for families who've been living with severe epilepsy. Another 40% will have a worthwhile improvement, and then the remaining 50%, it doesn't seem to work. And again, these are in very specific forms of epilepsy, and we'll get to talk about it, probably only affecting a couple of hundred people in Ireland at this time, those particular forms. So that's really the chemistry of it. How it emerged, I suppose, is a very interesting story. I mean, there was a legalized, the whole illegality of cannabis is a fascinating sociological story, which goes back to prohibition the idea that people getting high was not something that any advanced society wanted, and therefore it was banned for 70 or 80 years. And then in California, patients were taking cannabis for spasms in multiple sclerosis and pain, and also epilepsy. And that's when, in 1996, it was made legal in California. And now most states in America are not only legal for medicinal use, but also for recreational use. So over the years, really a lot of this came from families who said they had no options. They had the worst forms of epilepsy. And the most famous patient is probably Charlotte Figge, the little girl whose dad was a soldier in Afghanistan. And in 2012, his wife was at home. He was on tour of duty in Afghanistan. His daughter had this very severe epileptic condition called Dravet syndrome. She was having about 300 seizures a month. All of them were fall down convulsions. And he started looking online, trying to find a solution. And he realized that there's something about cannabis, not only about cannabis, but something about this pure CBD form. And he persuaded this grower in Colorado called the Stanley Brothers to make a somewhat as pure as possible CBD form, which became known as Charlotte's Web, which was an oil-based CBD with a small amount of trace THC. But they grew it specially for her, and her rate of seizures went from 300 a month to about 2 a week. And that was very dramatic. And there was a documentary on CNN called Weed by Dr. Sanjay Gupta, and that sort of, the whole thing blew up. I remember inviting Elizabeth Teal, who was one of the primary investigators in the CBD studies in 2016 to 2019, and she came to give a talk here in 2015, and she said to me, "Has the whole cannabis thing blown up yet?" And I said, "What cannabis thing?" And I was probably the first neurologist to ask that question, what cannabis thing? And then, of course, within a couple of months, everybody was talking about it, and it's become a huge issue. So I think we're going to stop there. If there's any clarifications, I hope I've given as quick an overview as I can. And maybe some of the other guests would like to fill in some gaps.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely brilliant. Thank you very much, Colin. And I think it's important, given the nature of the subject that we're about to discuss as well. Maybe Bryan or Norman, you'd just like to fill in, there's a couple of details left that I think we might want to fill in, which is the nature of those types of epilepsies that potentially are currently seem to be best suited to this. And maybe explain to us briefly, because we're going to mention it later on, the medical cannabis access program and the ministerial licensing route, and what both of those are. Who wants to field that?
If you like, because they're mostly childhood disorders, I'll be happy to talk about the forms of epilepsy and maybe a little bit about ministerial licensing, if that's okay. So I suppose the two best studied forms of epilepsy in which benefit has been demonstrated for children with epilepsy are Dravet syndrome, which Colin mentioned, and the Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, which is another very severe form of generalized epilepsy. Dravet syndrome, obviously there are parents here who know a lot about it. We're on the panel. It's a very severe form of epilepsy. It begins in the first 1 to 2 years of life. They have very severe prolonged seizures, and then they evolve into multiple seizure types. And it's a devastating form of epilepsy. It's associated with a risk to life from prolonged seizures as well. So anything you can do to improve the severe prolonged seizures in these children is a priority. In that population, there's clear evidence that some children have benefited from CBD products. And likewise, in the Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, there's a published study which shows some benefit for some people with Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, which again is a very severe form of epilepsy, a little bit later onset, or sometimes evolving from an earlier severe form of epilepsy, in which there are seizures including sudden drop attacks, falls to the ground, atypical absences, generalized tonic-clonic seizures, and often associated with learning disability and with very significant changes on the EEG. So they're the kind of two best studied forms of epilepsy in which a benefit for CBD has been demonstrated clearly in clinical trials. So that means studies where you took a population, people with the disorder, you gave a placebo, a non-active treatment to half of them, you randomized it, nobody knew what they were on, and they looked at outcomes. And with regard then to the ministerial license issue, that is something I've had to learn my way through all of this, as most of us physicians have had to. The minister can provide a banned substance for medicinal use on the request of a consultant. And so therefore, if there is a product that contains a percentage of THC that's regarded as a significant percentage of THC, that product can be accessed via a ministerial license from a consultant. So it's important to note that that process is not for a pure CBD product, which is not a banned substance. And then it's about products that have a small amount of THC, so minuscule that you couldn't detect it. And it's about varying degrees of that. So I had to learn my way through this because I was prescribing a product called Bedrolite, which a number of people would be familiar with, which we obtained from a pharmacy in Holland. Why was I doing it there and why were we getting it from Holland? Because we knew that that was a properly supervised, properly formulated product that was we knew exactly what was in it. And that happened to have a small component, less than 0.4% of THC. I was prescribing it without a ministerial license, and then I got a phone call saying, hang on, you can't do this. We regard that as significant, so we had to get a ministerial license. So I have had, I think I have a total of 8 patients that I have at one point or another had a ministerial license to provide Bedrolite for. I know Norman has, and I know Colin has as well. And that's really the story with the ministerial license. It's a very tortuous process. You get approval for 3 months initially, and then you reapply every 6 months to renew the license. And then obviously this is a very expensive product, this particular one. I have to then separately apply to get funding for reimbursement of those families for the cost outlay. And then these families were taking Ryanair flights over to Holland to get the product at their own expense, and we were looking for reimbursement of that. And in the COVID era, the Department of Health has provided a courier service whereby they send a courier over who collects the product for those families that we've written prescriptions for and bring it back to the family. So it's certainly something you have to find your way through, and you have to learn the nuts and bolts of it, and not very straightforward, not something you'd intuitively understand. So I think that's the answer to your 2 questions, or maybe not. If not, ask me more.
Yeah, and maybe just briefly, Bryan, explain to us the nature of the Medical Cannabis Access Program then as well. Okay,
so I was on the group that was appointed in the Department of Health to look at setting up a medical cannabis access program. And that began its work in around 2017 and was completed over a year or so. And there's a document produced with the recommendations of that group, which is up on the Department of Health website. Everybody can access that document. And there were experts from other medical fields that I know nothing about, experts from pain field, from experts dealing with spasticity, with palliative care, with chemo, for chemotherapy, etc., chemotherapy side effects. But obviously my interest was in epilepsy. And at that point, the situation hasn't really changed now. The evidence base that we had then and we have now is that there is a limited amount of evidence that pure CBD products can work for certain forms of epilepsy, the forms we've described, Dravet syndrome, Lennox-Gastaut syndrome. It has been looked also in a population who just have severe epilepsy, whatever the cause, and there hasn't been as good a level of study or of outcome evidence in that population. So at the end of it all, with regard to epilepsy, it's very clearly laid out in that document. We looked to provide a pure, or as close to pure as possible, CBD preparation by the MCAP, which would be used then for individuals with severe medically refractory epilepsy that have failed a number of drugs, and also separately for individuals with Lennox-Gastaut syndrome or individuals with Dravet syndrome. So that, relevant to epilepsy, that was the outcome of that document and that group. And then the Department of Health set up the MCAP program on foot of that. Now, the problem we all have is that that MCAP program does not provide us with a pure CBD product, and it doesn't look like it will. in spite of the very clear recommendations that we made in that group. So that's the problem with MCAP as it is configured and as it is set up, and in terms of what may or may not, what products may or may not be supplied under MCAP. So MCAP will be a medical cannabis access program, and the conditions were epilepsy with the criteria that we've just laid out, and also spasticity and multiple sclerosis and intractable nausea and vomiting in people on chemotherapy. They were the three indications for MCAP. Unfortunately, it looks like MCAP as it's currently set up, and my colleagues can step in and talk some more about this, it's not going to provide us with a pure CBD product. It hasn't, and it doesn't look like the way it was configured, the way the legislation is written, that it will do so. To be honest with you, we get into nuances about how legislation is written and how it's interpreted by the powers that be, and that's a whole ball of wax, and certainly a situation that we're completely unhappy about. Yeah.
I'm going to, you're right, maybe we've now done the groundwork. I'd like to ask some of the broader questions. Norman, I'm going to come to you, and maybe you would explain to us, because it's a question that I've seen, or a conversation that I've seen happening amongst people about cannabis products that you can currently buy over the counter from local pharmacies, and their use in the treatment of epilepsy, and whether or not that is a thing.
Yeah, I completely agree with what my colleagues have said. I want to expand on that in a second, but to answer your question, first of all, Rick, and good morning, everybody. The CBD that one can buy at the corner shop is not seen by the state as a medicine. It's a special food. It's almost like a supplementary food, and the people selling, the shops selling those products can't offer any essentially medical claims for these products. And of course, we don't know what's in them because we don't know the purity of the CBD in these products. And we all have patients who come into our clinic and who, out of desperation because of the difficult epilepsy, usually, although some people with well-controlled epilepsy do also take CBD supplements as a food supplement, because that's what it is from a regulatory point of view. We don't know how much CBD is in those different products that are available. It's a whole industry in and of itself, and it's completely unregulated. So to go back then, because it links around nicely to the whole frustration here with MCAP and CBD, right? So, and myself and my colleagues have been trying to explain this in various media outlets over the last month or two. So just imagine this for a moment, and I was thinking about this again this morning. It's the classical situation where two organs of the state aren't communicating with each other for whatever reason. It's just that they're doing their thing. So the only pure CBD, pharmaceutical grade CBD, Rick, that is approved by the European Medicines Agency, and everybody has heard about the European Medicines Agency at this point because of the vaccines. The only pure CBD is a medication called Epidiolex, and that's the CBD, pure CBD pharmaceutical formulation that were used in those clinical trials that showed benefit in Dravet syndrome and Lennox-Gastaut syndrome that Bryan was just talking about. So this is approved by the European Medicines Agency, and it's not reimbursed by the state, although it is going through a very lengthy process of assessment. So then you have the MCAP program, which is really what we as treating clinicians don't want at this stage. And I don't know how much the Department of Health have spent on the MCAP program, engaging with various pharma and approving different compounds and paying for compounds. Like in Amsterdam, there was one just approved this week, Cannabis, which is made by an Australian company, and that also contains a small amount of THC. So can you imagine, so if we go back to compare it with COVID, that you have a medicine or a vaccine that's approved by the European Medicines Agency that the state is not paying for or reimbursing, but on the other hand, it's reimbursing a product that's not approved by the European Medicines Agency. And both systems they're running in parallel, and we and families and patients are in the middle of all this. It is beyond frustrating. I mean, Bryan and ourselves and colleagues have been working on this since 2017. Simon Harris announced the MCAP in June 2019, nearly 2.5 years ago. And Epidiolex was approved by the European Medicines Agency for Dravet syndrome and Lennox-Gastaut, I don't know, Bryan, probably about 15 or 18 months ago. So it is beyond frustrating. And then to circle back to your original question, and I'll stop for a moment, all the CBDs that patients buy out there, and they're probably, I don't know how much they cost a go, maybe 80 euros. None of these are regulated. We don't know what's in them, and the shops can't be claiming any medical benefit.
So maybe I don't necessarily want you to stop, and Norman, maybe explain to me then what you and your colleagues would like to see happen in the future.
We would like, I think, speaking personally, I think all my colleagues would agree, we would like Epidiolex to be reimbursed. Simple. One short sentence to answer that question. We want Epidiolex to be reimbursed.
And a second follow-up question, is that something that any of you can see happening in the foreseeable future?
It's been going on a long time. I mean, Bryan and Colin and myself and colleagues have frequent, and Peter indeed, have frequent correspondence about this. And Bryan sent us an email the other day that he heard on the proverbial grapevine that it may be true soon. But I mean, we've heard this so often, so it's I don't know. I mean, Colin and I engage with the HSE department, which is actually housed in St. James's Hospital, about the need for this. I don't know if Colin and Bryan have any inside information as to when it's going to be reimbursed, but it's just, I don't know. It could be Monday, it could be a year. It may not be reimbursed at all. I don't know.
That must be intensely frustrating for all of you as clinicians who are dealing with patients on a day-to-day basis.
Yes, very. I know, Bryan, Colin, you want to come in terms of frustrations, and what do you think, whether is the Epidiolex going to get through the door soon? I don't know. I
can just speak to, I suppose, people might know that I spoke to the Oireachtas Committee this week, and I engaged with the various Department of Health and other representative bodies that were speaking before. And I said to them exactly what you've just said, Norman, and the frustration about the MCAP in particular, that it wasn't delivering anything for us and our patients. And I think was made very clear at that committee proceedings is that, number one, the approval process is an independent process that the minister can't interfere with, there can't be political interference with, and it's very slow and very tortuous. And so at the bottom line, we don't know what the final decision would be. I suppose in response to my expression of the frustrations you very eloquently outlined there, Norman, there seemed to be a covert hope or wish that it may get across the line. Again, relevant people weren't stating the exact time frame in which that might happen. And you and I have spent many times talking to families say, I expect something by the end of the year. And that was 2 years ago. So
like it's Groundhog. Every consultation like that, sorry to cut across you, is Groundhog Day. It's unbelievable.
Absolutely. Yeah, so I'm no wiser. So Colin wants to say something.
Sorry, no, I just wanted to maybe expand a little bit on 2 points were made. I think Norman's description of what could help here is very succinct, and it's exactly correct. Yeah. For those families out there who don't have these particular conditions, so the licensing would mean that this drug is available for reasonably rare conditions. But the fact is that we as epileptologists have, over the years, every single drug that's ever come out, we've expanded the use license using what we call off license. So it is ultimately going to be the simplest solution and the one that we want. And it's very important to remember that the only reason that we, Bryan, myself, Norman, engaged in the whole MCAP, because this goes back to 2017. We, at that point, you know, the company called GW Pharma, who make Epidiolex, a relatively small pharma company. They don't make anything else except CBD. You know, we didn't know how long it was going to take them to apply for licenses, etc. So we were, the MCAP to me, in sitting in February 2017, when Bryan and I wrote the first HPRA report, we thought, give us something, please. We're the people sitting at the back of the desk. This is where the rubber hits the road. Patients are telling us that they want, and like we don't have confirmatory data, but Bryan, Norman, and I would all be clear, and this is a dramatic statement, I'm clear that there are patients who've passed away as a result of their epilepsy since 2017 because of the severity of it. Okay, And I'm not saying that if the MCAP had got up and running in 2017, that would have necessarily changed that, but at least we would have given some chance and some hope to families. So the MCAP was a stopgap. We all envisaged Epidiolex was going to come down the road, was going to be licensed. Then we'd have a drug that we could prescribe in the normal way to our patients. It would be reimbursed in the normal way. And the MCAP was supposed to be a stopgap measure. And then whatever happened, and I think, there's no sugarcoating this. Bryan was I don't know, he was kind of nice about it, in my view. Like, we have been working at complete cross purposes with the department. There's no way of sugarcoating this. We specifically said in 2 written documents, the one that Bryan and I wrote, which is the HPRA document, and the one Bryan was involved with another colleague of ours, Peter Willis-Walsh, in the clinical advisory group that met the summer of 2017. We said we need a product that as little as possible THC in the MCAP program. And for whatever reason, that just never happened. And multiple conversations, and this is not a question of us not talking to the right people, multiple conversations with the department. And if I was reflecting on it, why it happened this way, I suspect, as Bryan mentioned, somebody wrote the legislation and didn't really get that. They wrote the legislation, and the legislation said the MCAP is for people who want an illegal product to use for their epilepsy. They didn't take account of what we really wanted, and therefore it's gone on. And now the pharmacists in the department are left kind of clearing up and saying, well, how do we get around this? The legislation is written in this way. I will say one final point. Some people will know, particularly patients who come to my clinic will know that there are other products out there. They're not the ones you go in and buy off the shelf, okay, from the pharmacy, but there are some higher grade, almost pure CBD products that are available out there. One that I use is called PCBD 110. This is a drug with a trace amount of THC. It's got a manufacturing license from Europe stating that it's of high quality, so it's not the same as the ones in the pharmacy. And that can be given to patients. It's not illegal because of the trace amount of THC. Unfortunately, it's expensive. It costs somewhere in the region, for an adult, I deal with adults mainly, somewhere in the region of 600 to 1,200 euro a month to be on that formulation. And, again, despite many attempts to get this on the MCAP, I mean, this is ideally placed to go in the MCAP, right? Because it's never going to be a drug. It's never going to be like Epidiolex. It'll never go through the drug reimbursement process. So it's ideal for MCAP. It fulfills all the criteria that Bryan and I and Norman wanted for MCAP, which was a low THC, high CBD, reliable, European manufacturing licensed produced product. But it's not going. We just can't get it on to the MCAP. And, for the life of me, I mean, there's a number of reasons that I've given. There's no point in going into them now. Essentially, what you need to know is the MCAP was a stopgap. It's not delivering. It's not giving the patients what they need. And getting Epidiolex across the line, as Norman said, is the only, as far as I'm concerned, it's the only remaining option. We just got to get this drug across the line. And, whatever political, I know there's supposed to be no politics in this. I understand that, but you know what? Politics is politics. Politics is what we, is our society. And to say that there's no political interference in these things, like as Norman said, in the era of COVID, it'd be inconceivable that some things wouldn't, this drug would not be passed in under emergency legislation. Inconceivable. And by the way, and forget about COVID. Like, think about the other conditions we deal with every day. This goes back to a kind of a broad problem with chronic conditions in our country, and epilepsy being one. If this was cancer, this wouldn't be enough. We wouldn't be talking about this. We just would not be. If there was a new cancer drug that was out there that patients needed to save their lives, which is what we're talking about, Epidiolex, we wouldn't be having this conversation, not in a million years. And I think that goes back to a very, very important misunderstanding, antipathy, or lack of concern about a condition like epilepsy. I mean, you tell people that 150 people a year die from epilepsy, people take a double step. Oh, really? I didn't know that. People just don't know this. And it's not for the want of telling them. But so anyway, I've vented there, and let's get Epidiolex across the line. Let's have a letter writing campaign. Forget the idea that it's not political. It is political. Let's get this moving. Mention cancer, mention COVID in your letter, and get the thing moving.
I think it's genuinely brilliant to see all three of you talk so passionately about this subject, because sometimes it's one of those things that people can tend to believe is that those of you who are involved at the coalface of this, that you may not necessarily be as invested in this as they are as patients, which of course isn't true. I want to ask, and for anybody who wants to take this, I wanted to ask as well about your dealings with patients and perhaps maybe the main misconceptions that they raise with you when they're talking to you, and maybe the difficulties that causes. I don't know who wants to take that.
I mean, I'll take it briefly, and the others might want to join in. I mean, I think despite everything that we've said, and we do need Epidiolex as part of our treatment options for patients with particular conditions. And by the way, I think there was a question there about whether it's approved for tuberous sclerosis. I think Bryan will correct me if I'm wrong. I think it's just been approved over the summer from the European Medicines Agency as well, which is another genetic type of epilepsy. But the misconceptions that we see all the time, and we kind of touched on it already, the others have touched on it, is that there's too much store if we go to the other extreme, there's too much store put on by many individuals, patients, and families. And this is not necessarily a criticism; it's an observation that medical cannabis in whatever form is going to be a cure for that individual's epilepsy. And like we're talking about, temporal lobe epilepsy, other types of epilepsy. I mean, I've had a couple of individuals coming into me also, which is the other misperception. Let's say somebody is completely well and seizure free on a traditional allopathic medication like Keppra, levetiracetam, no seizures, no side effects. And I remember one or two of these consultations. Dr. Delanty, I want to change from Keppra to CBD because I want to be on a natural product. So there's that end of the spectrum as well. At the end of the day, as Colin nicely outlined at the beginning, the various compounds that are in cannabis and the two that are used in medicine or have been looked at in medicine, CBD and THC, are chemicals that get into the brain and act on receptors, and they may or may not help. And we don't really understand the biology of the endocannabinoid system. So there's lots of perceptions in terms of this is a pure product. I want it. I don't want to be on a drug that Big Pharma has made. Or number two, this is going to cure all epilepsy. That's the other end of the spectrum, which is wrong.
Yeah, because that's something even that I've potentially come across as being somebody who talks about epilepsy publicly. And anytime I've ever discussed the nature of the medication I'm on, which I've been seizure free now for 11 years at this point, fingers crossed, touch wood, that it's a conversation that people attempt to have with me, which is, why would you continue to be on that medication when you could be on a different product? And again, my only answer to that can be, I've been seizure free for 11 years. Does anybody else want to just take that briefly, maybe, Bryan?
Can I just add one other common thing that families say to me is sometimes where the child is already on a CBD preparation is, would you not put them on one with a bit of extra THC in it? I hear that's better. And they've heard from various people who, are linked to families who have had kids on various such preparations. And all of these people have sincerely held views and opinions, but that's unfortunately what they are just views and opinions. There isn't a medical evidence base right now. Maybe there will be in the future for CBD that, in addition to a THC component, the proper science, the proper studies haven't been done. Blondet isn't here today because she did a preliminary study, what's called an add-on trial, looking at safety and tolerability of a preparation that had a small component of THC. But there'd been no study where they've looked at a randomized, proper controlled study where you give somebody nothing and you give them the THC, the CBD plus THC, or you compare it with another treatment. That's never been done. So we don't know that is true, but lots of people come in and tell me, I know this is true because so-and-so told me, and they don't like it when you disagree with them. But we as doctors, we have to make decisions based on proper medical evidence, and that's just the way it is right now. Maybe that will change in the future if somebody does proper studies on CBD plus THC, but that hasn't been done yet. So that's a common one comes up to me, and Colin might like to speak about that as well.
Yeah, no, I think it's a very common one, and it's, I think, again, COVID is a good microcosm of what we've been dealing with the last 5 years. So, if you think about the arguments online about things like hydroxychloroquine, ivermectin, there are various products that have been, deemed suitable for treatment. And so strong is the belief among certain communities that that they think that the clinical trials, the sort of boring, lengthy trials that we do, are either, this is the charts that has been made to me, either we're in the pocket of big pharma. In other words, we don't want to say that this so-called natural product is suitable, because otherwise, pharma, who, I don't know, pay for my foreign holidays every year, then we'd be losing out on that. So and COVID is a classic example. I mean, everybody knows about the trials of these drugs and the fact that there are large groups of people who don't believe, what we consider to be the conventional medical evidence. And it is, see, my view of that is more a philosophical one. Conventional medical evidence is messy and it changes over time. Sometimes we start off, I mean, about none of us, Norman, Bryan, or I, would be either surprised or unhappy to find that THC is valuable as an add-on therapy. Fine, great. I'd love to get rid of that argument. But the problem is, at the moment, the evidence does not exist for that. And the people who are pushing this theory are often, in my view, involved in other ways with the whole kind of worldwide push to legalize recreational cannabis, because THC, of course, is an important part of. There's no point in having recreational cannabis legalized if you don't have THC, because that's what it is. And so, to my mind, that whole argument is much more sullied than the one about us are involved with big pharma, because we shouldn't. These are totally separate. I have no expertise in the social or political legislation around recreational cannabis. It's nothing to do with the expertise that we have. And so, anyway, I think we would ask our patients to have patience with us, that we are ready and willing to take whatever evidence exists out there for THC. But at the moment, that evidence does not exist, certainly for epilepsy. It may exist for pain. There's a big argument about its use for pain, etc. But for epilepsy, the evidence does not exist. And I think we are just asking for patience. What we want to do is, let's get the drug that their evidence exists, strong evidence exists in favor, and let's get that drug to our patients. Everything else is going to come down the pipeline. And if THC becomes an additional drug, then that's fine. Can I say one final point about THC? Because this is an important one. As I said, THC is this psychoactive product. In street cannabis, it's increased concentration now, much more than in the 1970s and 80s. And the big concern about THC really is around the developing brain. Nobody is trying to stop adults with proper adult agency getting a drug that they want to get high on. That's not what this is about. THC does appear to have significant effects on the developing brain, and that evidence is emerging now from studies around the world. And what we're concerned about is that any small amount of THC that's available in these anti-epileptic products will accumulate, because we're talking about large doses. The amount of oil that you give to patients to reach the minimum doses in the clinical trials. So just to give you an example, right? So about 5 milligrams per kilogram was the minimum dose in the clinical trials. So think of a child at 30 kilograms, okay? So 5 milligrams per kilogram, is 150 milligrams a day, and that's fine. You can get products that have very small amounts of THC, but as you go up in the doses, that small amount of THC becomes larger and larger. And in America at the moment, the basic dose equivalent that causes a high is 10 milligrams of THC. So that's what's in your average joint, if you like. 10 milligrams of THC causes a high in most individuals. And I can guarantee you, in the products that are out there at the moment, many, many people are looking for an oil that has very small amount of THC, but when you get to the doses that we normally use to treat epilepsy, that amount of THC, they're going to be getting that amount. So the question is, how do we feel about giving a joint a day to a child? That's the question. And, somebody would say to me, well, if it saves the child's life, is that choice reasonable to take. And, you know, if the evidence existed, we use lots of dangerous drugs. Chemotherapy is dangerous. You know, morphine is dangerous. Lots of dangerous drugs are used, but the evidence exists for their use. So what we're saying, at least how I feel personally, is if someone says to me, THC, yeah, it's got dangers, it's got issues, it's going to be psychoactive, people were going to feel high on it, even children will feel high on it, but if it saved their life, I think many parents would take that choice. Do you know what I mean? So what we need is the evidence before we can start just throwing this THC in as sure, listen, why not us add a bit of THC?
We will get to your questions, by the way. Please continue to put them in the Q&A box. There are a lot there already, so we'll get to as many of them as we can. And I'm conscious that Norman has to leave us relatively soon. But maybe this final question I want to ask you before we get to the Q&A kind of ties in quite nicely to what you've just been talking about, which is, it ties into the COVID question as well. So where can people get reliable information on this? And how do they know whether or not that information is reliable? And I suppose a kind of parallel question is the pitfalls of searching online for information about this whole subject. Whoever wants to take that.
I
mean, go ahead, Bryan, sorry.
The Department, I'll let Norman, the Department of Health document is a pretty good summary of where we were at, and it's available on the HSE. The one that was used as the basis for setting up the MCAP, you know, that's a pretty good summary of the level of knowledge and information to date. Now, it's from 2017. You know, there hasn't been a whole lot of new information since then. Sorry, Norman.
No, sorry, Bryan. I mean, I think that you know, this whole that speaks to, you know, false fake news and all the stuff that's going around social media, Rick, on every topic that you care to talk about, that people from climate change deniers to COVID deniers to everything else deniers. So I think that Epilepsy Ireland and the other international epilepsy patient support organisation websites like Epilepsy Action UK and the Epilepsy Foundation of America, etc., all very robust, obviously English language websites would have very good information on this. I'd be very cautious about what you read on you know, if you like, free floating Facebook groups and other social medias, because you just don't, you know, there's so much unreliable and false information out there. You have to go to, for patients and families, go to the patient support groups. I think that the three of us have been agreeing with each other all morning. And Colin won't be surprised that I kind of disagree with one thing that he said. We always have to disagree. Well, I'm agreeing and disagreeing. Colin is asking for patience. PATIENCE. In fact, I think the time for patience is gone, and I do agree with Colin when he said earlier, like, there's 80 odd people here on this webinar this morning, and everybody knows everybody, you know, another person or another family and another family with epilepsy. And even if you're not affected by these particular disorders like Dravet and Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, and by the way, well, Lennox-Gastaut syndrome is not really just one condition; it's a sort of a host of generally other genetic conditions in childhood. But then talk to your TD or your local minister, right? Tell them we need Epidiolex. Like, I can prescribe Epidiolex on Monday morning. Bryan can, Colin can, but we can prescribe it because it's the only European Medicines Agency CBD product that's approved. Can you imagine that, going back to the COVID thing? But we can't, because it's, well, we can, but patients will have to pay for it, and it is expensive, yes, but lots of other drugs are expensive. And where these epilepsy types are, again, as we've heard, they're life-threatening. And if it was in the field of cancer or severe COVID, then the state would pay for it. Merck have just announced in the last few days of an antiviral agent which may cut hospitalizations of severe, or cut mortality, I think, of severe COVID by 1/2. That's going to be approved if the European Medicines Agency are happy with the data. And here we have a life-threatening group of epilepsies. We have a compound that's approved by the EMA, and we have politicians going around. They don't understand epilepsy, you know, and we need the 80 people here and the other contacts they have in their greater network to start calling at their TD constituencies and writing to them and say, we need this changed. The MCAP is, at this stage, is a complete diversion.
Just before we get to questions, one final question for all of you, and maybe if you have a 2 or 3 line answer for this. If somebody who is watching here today or a member of their family is taking a cannabis-based product without the knowledge of their clinician, what sort of advice would you give them?
Tell their treating clinician at their next appointment, 100%.
Is it that simple, gentlemen?
I mean, I mean, in my view, it is. I mean, I think, you know, the power differential that exists between, you know, consultants and professors and stuff and patients sometimes means that patients don't tell us, you know, everything. You know, it's not just limited to taking a product that we may not know about. It's about taking medication. It's about when they take it. It's about their alcohol levels. What we try to do is promote the idea, and more nowadays, that, you know, we're not going to get anywhere unless we're partners in this, you know. And if someone came into me and said, look, I'm taking this product and it's really helping me, I'm not in a position to say, stop that. I wouldn't do that. I might tell them, I might explain to them again. I'll go through, as Norman says, sometimes it's Groundhog Day. The script that we give to patients is often very similar. I'll explain to them what we know about it in regular medical terms. It's obviously up to that person to continue to, you know, they are in a position to take, you know, medicines as they see fit. And if it's helping them, I'm not going to stop them. But, you know, it does influence the next decision that I make, you know, about the next medicine I might use, or even taking them off some medicines that they're on. So, you know, this is a long-term project. I suppose the idea that doctors are no longer, you know, no longer deserve, nor is it helpful to be considered to be, you know, at some level that you can't really have a normal discussion with them. That's terrible for healthcare. We need to have a situation where our patients trust us to have an open conversation about their treatment. And we can disagree, and, you know, we can say, well, I don't think that's, you know, that wouldn't be how I would see it. That's all fine. But we absolutely need to be partners, and partners in healthcare, making the patient part of the healthcare team, if you like, is one of the projects that I've been working on for a few decades. And it wasn't there always. There's a lot of people in the audience will know that that there's sometimes they can't speak to their doctors or couldn't. And there may be some doctors out there who don't espouse that, but I know personally, Bryan and Norman and I, none of us want a situation where we can't have an honest discussion with our patient. It doesn't help anybody.
Okay, I'm going to get to oh, sorry, Bryan.
Can I just make two other minor points? So the question of interaction, I think, was raised on the questions. It may interact with, in particular, with a drug called clobazam, which we would commonly have children with Dravet or Lennox-Gastaut on. So we need to know, because of possible potential drug interactions. And I suppose what I would echo what Colin and Norman said. A, we need to know, and B, then I would explain that, you know, the reason we don't encourage that kind of activity is because we just don't know that what it says on the tin is on the tin. I was at pre-COVID, the last epilepsy meeting I was at, it was the end of 2019 in the States. There was a person from Colorado had done a really nice project where she looked at all the available products, what it said on the tin in terms of CBD and THC. These are all coming from various suppliers within the state of Colorado, and actually what was in them, and there was a huge discrepancy. That's the reason why we had people going to Holland to get a product that we know we can stand over. So I would have sympathized, and many of the families that I know where they put children on over-the-counter CBD products, look, I could see myself as a parent doing the same thing, you know, if that was what they thought was available to them and they had a terrible problem. So I can completely understand it. So that was the only add-on.
Yeah, you've helped us immediately. I was going to ask you that question anyway, so I can move that one out of the way. We do have a lot of questions, and I'm going to try and get through to as many of them as we can. Use the Q&A box. Don't use the chat box, please, if you've got a question you'd like to ask in the time we have available. Some of these will obviously just maybe be one-line answers. Some of them will be far more complicated, and we'll figure that as we go along. The Examiner reported this week that Epidiolex will replace Bedrocan. Is this the case? Who wants to have a go with that?
I think I know where that's coming from. I mentioned at the beginning that I had spoken to the Oireachtas committee, and I can say that 100% nobody who spoke to that committee said that Epidiolex would replace Bedrocan. I think there was a lot of to and fro, and just like Norman and Colin and myself have clearly said tonight, is that if we get Epidiolex approved, it will save us from going the Bedrocan or the Bedrolite route. And I know then that there are a number of families, and I can think of one family in particular, where they've had an excellent result with their child with Dravet syndrome from Bedrolite. they don't want to come off Bedrolite if Epidiolex gets approved in the morning. So I think that's where that question is coming from. And it's a very legitimate point of view. And I can't foresee a future where the powers that be in the Department of Health will be enforcing people to move to Epidiolex if they're already on a product that is clearly working for them. And certainly we'd fight on their behalf for that as well. I don't think that happened. Really, that dialogue was about the future, about us getting other patients who need it on a CBD product.
Okay. Second question, is Epidiolex now indicated for use for tuberous sclerosis complex similar to Dravet and Lennox-Gastaut?
Yes, is a simple answer.
Okay. Simple as that. If it's a one-word answer, it's a one-word answer. Let me see. I've got any reason why a pure CBD product is not included in the MCAP? Any explanation by the department? Is it just costs? Surely a more purified product is a better product for all, especially children, is the question.
I mean, this goes back to the discussion about, yeah, I mean, to a certain extent, I don't know the absolute answer. I certainly don't have a one line on it, unfortunately, not a one word, Rick. I mean, I think, again, trying to look at it historically, okay, when MCAP came around, it was a stopgap measure to, as far as the epilepsy specialists are concerned, to get us to, where Epidiolex was available. And we were prepared to accept that there wouldn't be pure versions, but that we could have a trace amount. Okay, so let's talk about what that means. So trace is usually anything less than 1% THC. So I saw a question there about Charlotte Figge. So Charlotte's Web, for instance, has 0.3% THC. So it's considered to be trace under most legislative components. So there's a tiny amount of THC in it. So the fact is that we thought, as the implication of the questioner is, yeah, surely let's get a CBD oil. This is what the neurologists want. It has a trace amount of THC, so it should go on the MCAP. But you see, this is where I think the problem was. The legislation is really only covering products that have more than trace. The legislation was wrong in that respect, insofar as it wrote down, we want to allow things with more than trace. Now, it hasn't said that explicitly, but that's what I've come to understand, is that they don't want products with trace. And I tried to find out why. Why not? Why not allow a trace product? And the answer was a vague answer. It was, it's going to cause all sorts of issues in the industry. For instance, all those drugs that are supposedly in the chemists, are supposedly have trace amounts of THC, they're all going to be suddenly banned because they're all supposed to be on MCAP. So there'll be uproar. Barrett and what's the name of that place? Holland and Barrett, for instance, have a CBD product, right? And they're saying, if we say trace THC is allowed on MCAP, that'll suddenly make the Holland and Barrett people have to apply to MCAP. So that we're going to cause a lot of industrial unrest in the CBD world. You know what I mean? Like, by the way, people talk about big pharma. Big weed is going to be one of the biggest organizations, capitalistic organizations in the world in the next decade. Okay. And there's massive, massive influence of these organizations on what's happening legislatively across the world in terms of, making products legal, etc. Again, my expertise is simply down to what we do with epilepsy. And the only thing I can think of is that the MCAP legislation is written, in my view, incorrectly. They made a mistake in not allowing trace THC products to go on, and therefore we are where we are. It's not purely. It may have some financial issue. I don't know what that is, but to me, it's a legislative problem.
I got a question here, and some of this has been covered already, but maybe whoever would like to have a go at this. It's a couple of questions together. As well as CBD, many patients have been treated successfully with THC, including Charlotte Figge, who was mentioned at the start, and patients here in Ireland. So why are the panel saying in their letter to the minister that they do not want to prescribe THC products? CBD Epidiolex doesn't work for everyone and is more expensive.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just start and others will view. I mean, I guess, I think we probably covered this. I don't want to be too much repetition here. Yes, there are many, many things on the internet which say that THC, not only do they say that it works, but they say that it's essential, right? They're saying that the treatment for epilepsy, that to me is medical misinformation, because it's based on some maybe personal small numbers of patients. I'm not saying that patients who have taken THC have not seen the benefit. I'm not saying that at all. But I'm saying in terms of, what we consider to be scientific evidence. This is very, very important. What we consider to be evidence, we're usually looking at several hundred patients, right? And that is measured against several hundred patients who are not taking the drug. That's called a placebo-controlled trial. And, you know, unless we see that kind of evidence, we cannot recommend the treatment with a potentially dangerous element. Now, many people who interact with me online and in person and always say, oh no, here's a study, and they point to some study which is very, very poorly done, very, very small numbers, not published in a recognized medical journal. Of course, you can find places where the so-called evidence is stated. But, you know, again, this is a matter of trust, because it goes down to the misinformation age. You know, there are many, many patients taking this, you know, horse parasite drug called ivermectin for the treatment of COVID. The studies that saw the potential value of that have now been proven to be, you know, not valuable. And, you know, still many people take it. So, you know, I don't know whether others want to pitch in on that. All we can say is you got to trust us. We're using our best, you know, training as medical scientists and taking the evidence as it appears to us, as agreed by us as medical scientists, not under any influence of big pharma or anything like that, purely the evidence as it comes to us across our desk. And that's, unfortunately, if people don't trust us in that, then, you know, that's fine. That's where we are. We live in a world where, you know, experts are considered now to be untrustworthy, and that's a very unfortunate situation. And yeah.
And I say the Charlotte's Web, you know, clearly worked very well for Charlotte. I mean, I have a small number of people for whom pure CBD clearly worked very well for the Dravet syndrome. Sadly, just a small percentage. So looking to get funding for other better treatments for Dravet syndrome. So, I mean, the bottom line is we don't know whether Charlotte would have done equally well on a pure CBD preparation. When I was on the MCAP committee, we had representation people around the world. I spoke to a head of child neurology at Denver Children's Hospital, because at that point in Colorado, they were having a whole bunch of people who had moved to Colorado to access cannabis for their children with Dravet syndrome and other things. And they weren't looking after these children. They were dealing with the downside of these kids were having lots of seizures and ending up in their hospital. And the level of information was very poor. But the lady I spoke to, who was head of neurology, was also former president of the American Epilepsy Association. She made the point that the people supplying the product had a kind of a regular way of going about things. Okay, this didn't work, we'll give you another one with a little more THC in it, we'll give you another one. That didn't work, we'll give you another one. So these people who were prescribing product were often people who had a vested interest in the supply of the product. And there was a regular element of how they operated and saying, oh no, we'll try this one with a bit more THC, we'll tincture exactly what works for your child. So, but again, that's all based on products that are completely unregulated, unsupervised, and nobody really knows what's in them. And when you take a hard look at what's in them, it's not what it says, often not what says what's in them. So it's a question of a belief system. And I would say sincerely held belief by some wonderful families and people that their child needs a component of THC. I'm not saying their views aren't sincerely held, but as Colin says, we have to operate based on reasonable medical evidence. And look, if that medical evidence arises in the future, happy days, then we would prescribe based on it.
Maybe Norman, just before you leave, you could get in on this.
Yeah, I do have to go, and thanks. I've really enjoyed the discussion, and so forgive me for leaving. I agree. Look, I mean, at the end of the day, yes, statistics are statistics, clinical trials are clinical trials. Every patient is different, and we all have patients and families coming into us, saying, I don't know, I changed my diet from this to this, and my epilepsy is much better. And of course, there are dietary interventions that can be helpful for epilepsy. But you hear individual stories, and that's the THC stories are individual stories, notwithstanding all the other stuff in the background. I mean, some of these companies that make these products, they're not small. These are companies with market capitalizations of billions. So it's not a trivial industry either, but we're not against it. We just need the evidence. And as has been said, if the evidence came out in a clinical study that THC at a particular percentage was good for a decent cohort of individuals, then we would love to be able to provide it. So, but if the current evidence went to the European Medicines Agency on THC, the European Medicines Agency wouldn't approve it because we don't have evidence. We don't have that kind of evidence. So I would agree, but it's we have evidence for the CBD Epidiolex, and we can't use that. Let's start using that, and then we'll use more products and more combinations as the evidence supports it, or otherwise doesn't support it. But we already have an evidence base on some of this medical cannabis for epilepsy, and we can't act on it. So that's the frustration. It's not like we're anti anything. We want to treat our patients. And the other thing before I go is we want to be able to treat our patients with the compounds that are approved, but not have to go through, also, we haven't really discussed it, a very significant administrative burdens to get some of these drugs. Like it's quite a hurdle and an output as well in terms of, and this is not just for epilepsy anymore. There's new migraine drugs that we're being asked to do unbelievable administrative stuff to get the drugs to our patients. So these are other factors that are there in the background. Anyway, look, thanks, Rick. I'm going to leave. Apologies, I have to head south. And thanks very much to everybody, and have a good rest of conference and a good weekend.
Thanks a million, Professor Norman Delanty. Cheers. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to move on questions for Colin. Colin, go for it.
I just want to add one small botanical point, which is interesting. I mean, people, just so they're clear, and this goes back to my original, discussion about, cannabis being a bit like tea. I mean, how you make it, where you grow it, the temperature, the sunlight, and you can change the components of this depending on where the plant is grown, right? So it turns out that the most robust cannabinoid, the easiest one to grow, is THC. You can grow that. We know about guys who've grown it in their back garden, or grow it down the basement, or grow it out in the greenhouse. A pure CBD plant is incredibly hard to grow. And one of the reasons for the expense of these pure CBD compounds is because you have to have this incredibly temperature-controlled environment and all that kind of stuff. So what I'm saying to you is that, and this goes back to the point Bryan was making, if you were to take all of the products that are available off the shelves in Dublin chemists now and subject them to analysis, you would find a huge number of them with THC in it, because that's easy to grow. The CBD content, which they claim it's all CBD, the purity of CBD is just not to be trusted. So, in the end of the day, as an ironic statement, in terms of, like, if people want to get THC containing compounds, go down to the local chemist and get the Holland and Barrett, because I guarantee you it has THC in it. But getting a pure CBD, which, as Norman says, God, this is so ironic. This is the thing, the evidence exists. It's really strong. It's like for terrible epilepsy, it's really, really strong evidence. None of us is questioning the use of this compound. And we can't prescribe the thing that works for it. And yet we do get a lot of people, irritation from people that were not getting on board on the THC entourage effect. I don't know if you want me to go into what that means, but the so-called entourage effect that they talk about in relation to THC. Like that THC has to be part of it or it doesn't work. That's what we're being told. No, you have to have THC in. You have to have THC. Like, my view would be this. The lion's share of the work, if an epilepsy is going to work, if cannabis is going to work for a type of epilepsy, the CBD is doing pretty much the lion's share of the work, okay? I'd be interested in research that shows that the addition of a small amount of THC might modify that and add a few extra seizure-free days, maybe. And that's the kind of research that I would be interested in. Pure THC compound, in my view, would be dangerous. All the evidence points to its danger at that high levels of percentage. You know what I mean? So the question simply is, to me, is, does a small amount of THC actually add anything to the profound effect that the CBD gives? And so, for instance, for argument's sake, let's say somebody tries a pure CBD compound and it doesn't work at all. I don't think going then on to one with a small amount of THC would do anything. Because if it's not getting the effect that the CBD wants, is supposed to do, then I don't think going just to THC compound. That's my view, but that has yet to be proven. That has yet to be proven one way or the other.
And maybe one of the questions that has been sent in, it kind of follows on from that. So it's a slight paraphrase here, but it says that given that cannabis has been around for thousands of years, and given that so many people say that THC is an important element in cannabis-based treatment, I'm going to bracket that with whether that's true or not. Why on earth do we still not have the scientific evidence that Dr. Doherty has spoken about?
Well, Bryan, I might take that and let you lead in. I think there's two issues there. And one of them is a very important point about, the absence of any really good research around cannabis pretty much after 1911, once people began to ban it, under prohibition laws. The studies of cannabis really did not, it was put in a box. Society decided there was no value. There was a congressional report in the 1970s and similar one in the Drugs Act in 1977 in Ireland, which said specifically that there was no medical benefit to cannabis. And that's against, the evidence going back thousands of years. So there was some political reason. I was too young in 1977 to have any role in that. There was some political reason why, it's a social political reason why. And like the history of this is fascinating. The word marijuana, which is what the Americans called, and medical marijuana is used for medicinal cannabis. That was introduced by the US government in order to blame Mexico for all its ills. They wanted to make sure that people understood it was all coming from the South. When does that sound familiar? There's nothing new on heaven and earth. Do you know what I mean? So we're still blaming, there are certain politicians in America still blaming the Mexicans for everything. So marijuana is a pejorative word for this in order to blame Mexico for importation. So I think that absence of any research up to probably the 1990s, that's why we don't have it. That's the first reason. The second reason is, and I actually don't quite understand this, maybe Bryan has a view, like one of the problems in most scientific research is that negative studies don't get published. If you say, I've got a new drug for epilepsy, and you do a study and it doesn't show anything, you send it into the editor, I'd like to publish this journal article, say, well, it's not very good, it didn't really work, did it? Why would we publish that? So there's a heavy bias in publishing positive studies. And the negative studies, unfortunately, either the companies who sponsor those don't want them published, and we don't want the world to know that this thing doesn't work, so we're not going to publish that, or the researcher themselves desperate to get it in. So there's a problem. There's actually a whole journal called the Journal of Negative Results, which has emerged because of the frustration over this. So I think what's happened is there probably has been studies. I'm not aware of them. There probably has been some. I mean, Bryan mentioned that there's been some safety study that was done by Blonnet McCoy herself. And I think just to be completely transparent here, I think that study did show that it was relatively safe in the levels that she had in that study. It was relatively safe, but it wasn't designed to show that it was better than pure CBD. So we still don't have that evidence. But maybe Blonnet is needed here to understand that. In my view, there are almost certainly studies out there that are negative that have not been published. Have positive studies not been published because of some bias against them? I don't know. I don't know why that would be. We're all desperate for a positive study. We would love a positive study to show that THC is valuable, but we just haven't had one. So anyway, I hope that answers somewhat as best I can. Bryan, do you have any perspective on that?
Well, the other part of it is, I mean, yeah, and certainly you remember Aaron Davinsky, who was well known, who was published in CBD and Lennox-Gastaut and Dravet syndrome, made the point that he would like to do studies comparing CBD plus THC with CBD. He's expressed that wish. Again, I don't see anything happening as yet. But the other thing as a researcher, first of all, there's a lot of hard work goes into designing a study and doing it and getting it completed. It costs a lot of money. You have to look for funding. If you apply for a research grant, and I've seen this happen with other areas, in particular, say muscular dystrophy, when I used to be involved with that. You know, if the people who review your proposal for funding for the research will say, well, look, where are you coming from here? You know, have you got a reasonable hypothesis, and is there enough for us to be confident in funding you that we might get a result that will help people? So that goes in there as well, you know. But I think there certainly has been an expressed will among people who have done research on pure CBD that they would also like to do research on CBD plus THC.
It's worth adding in at this point, Rick, just to amplify Bryan's point. You know, when the very first open access program in 2016 or 2015, it was published in 2016. This was done in the US using Epidiolex, a pure CBD, right? getting that study across the line, getting hospitals to agree to dispense this for all the world, the society was completely paranoid about in 2015. And my colleague over there, Elizabeth Teal in Boston, who was part of those studies, said, even though this was a pure CBD, no THC in it, they had federal agents wearing guns on their hips in the corridors while the patients were being enrolled in the study. You know, that there was so much paranoia about it. And I think that's probably feeding into the fact that getting a THC type of study across the line is just difficult. And, you know, if it's easier to do other types of study, maybe that's why. But I would plead that it's not a conspiracy. I mean, none of us, you know, as I said, we in the clinical world where the rubber meets the road, we would love to see a study coming through which clearly shows that additional THC is both not dangerous and is beneficial. But let's keep our eye on the prize here. We have a CBD product which does work, and we just can't prescribe it because it's too expensive for the ordinary individual.
I didn't think for a moment I'd be able to contribute this morning, but I've read a number of books based on that part of history. Maybe if people want to look it up, about Richard Nixon's war on drugs and about the early 1970s. And it's one of the specific reasons as to why cannabis can't be used as a medicine from there on, and then obviously can't be included in those kind of studies. There's a great article in Scientific American from 2016 called "The Science Behind the DEA's Long War on Marijuana." I'm sure someone will stick a link up to that somewhere, but it's an interesting history article, if nothing else. A couple of questions then, right? We've a few more just to get to. If you want to stick one final one in, please use the Q&A box here at the bottom. Can THC potentially improve stress and sleep, two potential triggers for seizures? That's a complicated question. Who wants to have a go at that?
Well, what's interesting is CBD can help you sleep. It's more of a sedative compound than THC. THC is more of a psychoactive compound that at the extreme dose, as Colin said, would give you a high. So obviously, again, anything is possible, but it wouldn't strike you as likely, you know, that would be a benefit from THC. Much more likely to get that benefit from CBD than from THC, which is known to cause drowsiness.
I would say that that there have been various ancillary behavioral effects of CBD, as Bryan says, that have been looked at as secondary outcomes from the trials. So a lot of kids and young adults with very bad epilepsy will have, you know, mood alteration in between attacks. They'll have sometimes, you know, hyperactive disorders, attention deficits, etc. And there's been secondary positive effects on those things. Now, none of the trials were designed to show that actually is the thing they're looking to fix. But Bryan will attest to this, and patients do report it as well. Patients report that there's other things, not just the seizure control, that they benefit from, and that's all just with CBD. Does THC, then again, I would say that we need those trials to show that the addition of THC causes an extra benefit on behavior. And I understand that hypothesis has been stated. People say, oh yeah, well, surely that does. And again, I'd be the first to be delighted to have a study showing that that's clearly the case. I understand that people say their individual experience of it is, but again, we need larger trials to show. And it's only simply because the opposite may also be true. It may actually be dangerous. That's the point. In the doses we're talking about here, particularly in a developing brain, you know, it's not an either or. It's not just why not throw it in. Sure, listen, why not? Just do it. It's that there's issues around the developing brain and THC which make it potentially dangerous. And that's why we need to be very vigilant and wait for the studies to come in.
Okay, I'm conscious that the time is getting upon us, but there's a number of questions here that I would like to get to if possible. So this is a kind of a merger of a couple. What does Epidiolex cost each month if you're paying yourself? And if paying yourself and struggling to meet the cost, do the panel have any advice for a family in this situation if it is working?
I think Norman mentioned a cost, but I've never done this, so maybe Colin knows better than me.
Well, broadly speaking, you know, the version that I use, the PCBD, is cheaper, and that costs about €275 per 30 ml bottle. Okay. And for adults, it's different for kids. For adults, which I deal with mainly, we're looking at a cost of between 600 and 1,200 a month. Epidiolex is more expensive. I think the starting cost is over 1,000 per month. And you know, this is the subject. This is the reason why the whole reimbursement negotiations are going on. Ireland is a small country. The leverage we have with a drug company is small. We're not like the NHS or the some of the large healthcare organizations in the States that have massive purchasing power. They can negotiate lower prices with a drug company. In Ireland, of course, we have a small population, relatively small, and we're talking about, initially at least several hundred patients only. And so the company is in a strong position to keep, its high cost. So I think broadly speaking, €1,000 a month would be the sort of starting range for Epidiolex. But remember, it could double depending on what works. As the dose goes up, you may need to be spending double. So you could be anything from 3,000 a month to 6,000 a month, or maybe even higher. So it's really out of the range of most ordinary people.
Somebody wants to know, I'd like to help make a difference or support these doctors for their patients to get Epidiolex across the line. So I'd like to write a letter to my TD or whoever I have to. My question is, because my child doesn't need to take this product, what should my letter state?
Well, first of all, I would say that I would, yes, certainly copy to your TD, but actually, again, the capacity to hide behind the notion that this drug reimbursement stuff is non-political means that the HSE is the one that's scheduling. Like for instance, go back to Bryan's point about saying, that there's people hoping that this thing will go across the line. But when I ask the question, well, when's the next meeting of the drugs reimbursement? When is the next meeting? We don't have one scheduled. Why not? Why don't we have a meeting scheduled for the discussion? So Paul Reid is the person to ring and talk to. You need to write to Paul Reid in the HSE and copy it to your TD and say, Paul, why can't we have a date for the next drug? I'll tell you why they don't want people standing outside with placards saying, can we get this drug? But I would say, why don't we do that? Why don't we tell us the date and we'll all be there? We'll all be there with you saying, get this drug reimbursed. So I think that it's really a HSE thing. I think you need to write to the HSE and say, please, can we have the date plus the rationale for not reimbursing a potentially life-saving drug that my child or my family needs. And I'm potentially going to give us, I think, maybe one final question here, although there might be one more after this. It's an interesting one. Is the focus on CBD or medicinal cannabis in recent years distracting from other issues that doctors and Epilepsy Ireland should be focusing on, i.e. more neurologists, epilepsy nurses, other new drugs that need to be advocated for, etc.? If either of you have an opinion on that.
Colin, I'm sure will speak very well about that. And I just give an example of that, Dravet syndrome. So there was a good study done in Dravet syndrome with CBD, and it showed a limited but not insignificant benefit, that some children benefited, but not nearly the level of percentage that you might have wanted. And that's kind of my experience with CBD and Dravet syndrome. It certainly helped a couple quite significantly, and some not at all, and some somewhere in the middle. A number of people have come off it. There's another new treatment called fenfluramine. This study was done around the same time, maybe it came out a little bit later, showed much higher level of benefit for Dravet syndrome. That product is now licensed in Europe, and I'm at the same stage that we are with Epidiolex with it, in that I want this across the line and reimbursed in the Department of Health. I got one child on it for free. I have another 3 or 4 that I want on it. And the families that come to me that are knowledgeable about Dravet syndrome, most of them know all about this, but it is a distraction, equally, I find I'm very willing to put a child with Dravet syndrome on CBD in the hope that they would be one of the children that the CBD works well for. But I know a bunch of other options that might work very well. Sometimes people want to bypass that, and that is frustrating. So if you ask me where I think CBD will be in the future, in 10, 15 years back, it'll still be something we have on the shelf that we use occasionally, and I hope we'll have better treatments with better side effect profiles and that are easier to use. So I think there is a distraction factor in it. It is a valuable treatment for some people, but it's probably something that's comparable to a number of the other treatments we have that work for some people, but not for everybody.
Yeah, Rick, I would, Peter Murphy, who's the CEO of Epilepsy Ireland, has been a great advocate for getting, trying to help to get these across the line. And, after what we learned with Bryan's Oireachtas committee hearing, he started talking about, well, here's this other option. And he outlined this next set of, negotiations. And I said, Peter, I'm so distressed. I'm so weary from this. I have spent hundreds of hours on this. And I'm not talking about just the hours of trying to talk to patients about what their options are, but hundreds of hours talking to officials, hundreds of hours talking to my colleagues, since 2015, hundreds of hours on committees, writing reports. I'm so distressed by how much time this has taken. And to the extent that I'm only a human individual, yes, it has totally taken away from other things that I would be doing in the world of epilepsy. I mean, you go back to this discussion about, working with patients as partners, and this is a huge area of interest from a research point of view for mine, and I think it's taken away from that. I think I have been blunted in my capacity to do research in other aspects of epilepsy care. So I'm tired. I'm weary. I'm a broken man. You know what I mean, in relation to this one issue, and I don't know how much more I can do. I said to Peter, I'll admit it straight up. I said to Peter, I just don't think I can do it. I don't think, unless you can give me some guarantee that the next phase of negotiations is going to lead to something. I'm very distressed by it. I'm very distressed by it.
And sadly, not necessarily the tone I thought we were going to leave it on, but nonetheless, that's exactly where we are right now. Can I thank Professor Norman Delanty, who was with us earlier on, Professor Colin Doherty, and Dr. Bryan Lynch for being our panel this morning. Apologies to not get into everybody's questions. There are, just from what I can see here, at least 36, which would probably keep us here for another hour and a half. But thank you very much for joining us this morning. I think Peter is going to finish us out, I think. But from me, that's it for this morning, and thank you so much.